You're listening to The Cost of Holding On. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 1. The Weight of the World. Part 1. Ryan Carter gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, staring at the unopened bills stacked beside the microwave. The red, past due, stamps on the envelopes burned into his vision. Rent. Electricity. His mother's latest hospital visit. It was all too much. A sigh escaped his lips as he rubbed his tired eyes. He glanced at the time, 6:47 p.m. He had exactly 13 minutes before he had to leave for his night shift at the gas station. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. There wasn't enough food left for him to waste a meal. "Ryan, did you eat?" His mother's voice was weak but still laced with concern. Laura Carter leaned against the doorway, wrapped in a thick sweater despite the summer heat. Her cheeks were hollow, her once bright blue eyes dulled by exhaustion. "I'll grab something later," he lied. Her frown deepened, but she didn't push. They both knew there was no later. "Can you at least sit with me before you go?" she asked. Ryan hesitated. Every minute counted. If he left early, he might pick up an extra shift. But as he looked at her frail frame, guilt twisted in his chest. "Yeah, of course." He helped her to the couch where Sophie, his 16-year-old sister, sat with her nose buried in a textbook. Her headphones were in, but she pulled one out when Ryan sat down. "You're working late again?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Yeah." Sophie didn't argue. She just nodded and returned to her book, but the tight set of her jaw told him everything. She hated this. She hated that their lives had become this endless cycle of survival. Their mother coughed, a deep rattling sound that made Ryan's stomach drop. "Mom." "I'm fine," she interrupted. "It's just a cold." Ryan shot Sophie a glance and she gave him a look that screamed, "We both know that's not true." Laura shifted slightly, wincing as she adjusted her position. "How was school, sweetheart?" she asked Sophie. "It was okay. I got the letter today." Ryan's head snapped toward her. "The summer program?" Sophie nodded, her expression unreadable. Laura's face lit up. "Did you get in?" Sophie hesitated, then pulled a crisp letter from her book and handed it to Ryan. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. "Dear Miss Carter, we are pleased to inform you." Ryan's chest swelled with pride, but it deflated just as fast. The tuition cost was listed at the bottom. $3,800. His throat tightened. There was no way. "I can decline," Sophie said quickly, already sensing his reaction. "It's not a big deal." "Yes, it is," Laura argued. "Sophie, this is an amazing opportunity." Ryan forced a smile. "We'll figure something out." Sophie just nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Ryan glanced at the clock, 6:58. He had to go. He kissed his mother's forehead, gave Sophie's shoulder a squeeze and grabbed his keys. "Lock the door behind me," he reminded them. Then he stepped out, leaving behind the warmth of home for the cold reality of the world outside. The gas station was quiet when Ryan arrived. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he grabbed an apron from the back. "You're late," muttered Tony, the store manager, without looking up from the register. "Only by a minute," Ryan shot back. Tony snorted. "A minute's the difference between a paycheck and getting fired." Ryan ignored him. He had bigger problems than Tony's attitude. The first few hours of his shift dragged by. He stocked shelves, rang up customers and wiped down counters. It was mind-numbing work, but at least it kept his mind from spiraling. At around 11 p.m. the bell above the door jingled and Ryan barely glanced up before muttering, "Welcome in." "Ryan." He froze. Emily Lawson stood in front of him, her hazel eyes wide with surprise. She looked the same, long wavy brown hair, an expensive purse slung over her shoulder, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than his rent. Ryan's grip on the counter tightened. "Emily." "I thought that was you," she said, smiling. "How long has it been?" Ryan shrugged. "A while." Emily looked around as if taking in the gas station for the first time. "You work here?" "Yeah." "Oh. Pause. I didn't know." Ryan gave a humorless chuckle. "Didn't exactly put it on social media." Emily shifted, suddenly looking uncomfortable. I just haven't seen you around campus." "I figured." "I had to take some time off," he said shortly. Her brows furrowed. "You mean you dropped out?" Ryan exhaled through his nose. He didn't want to do this. Not here. What do you want, Emily? She flinched at the coldness in his voice but recovered quickly. She hesitated. I miss you. Ryan's stomach twisted. He missed her too. But that didn't change anything. I gotta get back to work. Emily searched his face. Can we talk? Maybe after your shift. Ryan hesitated. He wanted to say no. To avoid the inevitable questions, the pity in her eyes. But against his better judgment, he nodded. Fine. I'm off at 2. Emily smiled. I'll wait. As she walked out, Ryan let out a slow breath. He had no idea what he was doing. But maybe, just maybe, talking to Emily wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. The gas station was quiet again, save for the faint hum of the refrigerators and the occasional flicker of the old neon sign outside. Ryan leaned against the counter, watching Emily through the glass window as she sat on the hood of her car, scrolling through her phone. Why was she even here? They hadn't spoken in over a year, not since his life had turned into a constant battle for survival. Back when things were easier. When they were just 2 college kids sneaking out for late-night drives and talking about their dreams like they weren't impossible. That felt like a lifetime ago. The clock above the register ticked closer to 2 a.m., and Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. The last thing he needed was to get caught up in the past, especially with Emily. Still, when his shift finally ended, he found himself walking outside, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets. Emily looked up. Hey. Ryan nodded. Hey. A beat of silence stretched between them. Emily tilted her head, studying him. You always sucked at small talk. Ryan huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah, well, it's late. She slid off the hood of her car, crossing her arms. Want to get out of here? Drive around like old times. He hesitated. The responsible thing to do would be to go home, try to catch at least a few hours of sleep before his morning shift at the auto shop. But something about Emily standing there, looking at him like he wasn't just a guy drowning in overdue bills, made him nod. Yeah. Okay. Emily grinned, unlocking her car. Hop in. Ryan slid into the passenger seat, sinking into the leather. He'd forgotten how nice her car was. Sleek, new, smelling like lavender and something faintly citrusy. It was a stark contrast to his life, to the exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. As she pulled onto the empty streets, Emily glanced over. So, are you going to tell me what happened? Ryan stared out the window. What do you mean? She scoffed. Come on, Ree. You were on track to graduate early, had that internship lined up. Then you just disappeared. Everyone thought you transferred. He let out a slow breath. I had to take care of my family. Emily frowned. And school. Ryan's jaw clenched. Couldn't afford it anymore. Silence filled the car, thick and heavy. Emily finally spoke, her voice softer. Ryan, I would have helped if you. I didn't want help. His tone was sharper than he intended, but he didn't apologize. And I still don't. Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel. You do realize you're allowed to lean on people, right? Ryan shook his head. Not when they're struggling just as much. She sighed, taking a turn onto a quieter road, lined with trees that cast long shadows under the streetlights. So what now? He gave a humorless chuckle. I work. I pay bills. I keep things from falling apart. And what about you? Ryan frowned. What about me? She glanced at him before turning her attention back to the road. Do you even have time for yourself? For anything other than surviving? Ryan didn't answer. Because really, what was there to say? Emily sighed, shaking her head. You used to talk about moving to Seattle, remember? Getting a little apartment near the water, working at a design firm. Yeah, well, dreams don't pay rent, he muttered. She was quiet for a moment. Then softly, that's not the Ryan I knew. Ryan exhaled through his nose. Yeah, well, he didn't have to worry about hospital bills back then. Emily didn't argue. Instead, she pulled the car into a parking lot overlooking the city skyline. They used to come here all the time, back when life was simpler. Ryan stared out at the lights stretching across the horizon. Why are you here, Em? She hesitated. I guess she sighed. I missed you. Ryan turned to look at her, but she wasn't meeting his gaze. She was fidgeting with the bracelet on her wrist, something she only did when she was nervous. She took a slow breath. Things haven't exactly been great on my end either. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? She let out a bitter laugh. My dad's got my life planned out for me. Graduate early, take over his company, marry some rich guy I don't even like. She shook her head. It's exhausting. Ryan raised an eyebrow. So what? You want to switch lives? Emily snorted. Tempting. But I don't think I'd last a day with you. Ryan smirked. Yeah, well, I wouldn't last a day in yours either. For a moment it was almost like old times, just the two of them sitting under the stars trading jokes that masked deeper truths. Emily turned to him, her expression more serious. Ryan, I know you don't want help, but let me do something. Even if it's just covering Sophie's summer program. Ryan stiffened. No. She sighed. Why not? Because it's not your responsibility, he said firmly. Sophie's my sister. My mom is my responsibility. Not yours. Emily shook her head. That's not how friendship works. Ryan exhaled. It's not about friendship. It's about pride. She studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Hey, I get it. He wasn't sure if she actually did, but at least she dropped the subject. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for a while neither of them spoke. Eventually Emily sighed. I should get you home. Ryan nodded. Yeah. As she drove back, the silence between them wasn't as heavy as before. But it wasn't comfortable either. When she finally pulled up in front of his apartment building, she turned to him. Ryan. He looked at her. Just, don't shut me out completely, okay? Ryan hesitated, then nodded. Emily gave him a small smile. Good night, Ree. Good night, Em. As he stepped out of the car and watched her drive away, Ryan felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope. He wasn't sure if he liked it.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You're listening to The Cost of Holding On. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 2, Buried Beneath the Bills. The morning sun barely crept through the cheap blinds of Ryan's tiny apartment, casting dull streaks of light onto the worn-out carpet. His alarm had gone off 10 minutes ago, but he still sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the numbers in his banking app. $42.76. Rent was due in 3 days. The electricity bill wasn't far behind. And groceries? He'd have to stretch whatever was left in the fridge for at least another week. With a tired sigh, he shoved his phone into his pocket and ran a hand through his hair. No time to dwell on it. He had work. His mom was still asleep when he left, curled up in the recliner they'd shoved into the corner of the small living room. She had taken to sleeping there lately, claiming it was better for her back. He knew the truth. Her bedroom door was broken, the hinges too loose to close properly, and she hated feeling exposed. Ryan grabbed his keys and slipped out quietly. The auto shop was already sweltering by the time Ryan arrived. The scent of motor oil and sweat clung to the air, mixing with the low hum of the radio playing from the back. "About time you showed up," grunted Pete, his boss, an older man with grease-stained hands and a permanent scowl. "Thought you might have run off to the Bahamas with all that money you're making." Ryan snorted as he grabbed his coveralls. "Yeah, I'll send you a postcard." Pete grinned before nodding toward the garage. "Got a Camry with transmission issues. Customer wants it done today." Ryan wiped his hands on a rag and got to work, focusing on the familiar rhythm. Check the fluid, inspect the gears, diagnose the issue. It was methodical. Predictable. Unlike everything else in his life. By noon he was drenched in sweat, his shirt sticking to his back. "You good, kid?" Pete asked, handing him a water bottle. Ryan took it gratefully. "Yeah. Just tired." Pete leaned against the tool bench. "Still picking up extra shifts at the gas station?" Ryan nodded, taking a long sip. Pete sighed. "You're burning yourself out." Ryan shrugged. "Not much choice." Pete studied him for a moment, then reached into his back pocket, pulling out a folded bill. "Here." Ryan frowned. "What's this?" "Bonus," Pete said simply. Ryan eyed the $50 bill warily. "You don't do bonuses." Pete smirked. "Yeah, well, I'm feeling generous." Ryan hesitated. He hated taking handouts, but Pete wasn't the kind of guy to offer charity. With a reluctant nod, Ryan took the money. "Thanks." Pete clapped him on the shoulder. "Just don't kill yourself working, all right?" Ryan managed a small smile. "No promises." By the time he got off work, Exhaustion was a familiar weight on his shoulders. He was debating whether to head straight to the gas station or stop by home first when his phone buzzed in his pocket. "Emily, meet me at Joe's diner. I'm buying." Ryan frowned at the message. Joe's was their old spot. Back when they were still close, before everything had fallen apart. Before he'd started pushing people away. For a second he considered saying no. But the thought of a real meal, something warm and greasy and not from a can, made his stomach tighten. "Ryan, fine. But I'm paying for my own food." Emily's reply came almost instantly. "Emily, nope. See you at 10. Ryan sighed, shaking his head as he pocketed his phone. Joe's diner was the same as ever. Checkered floors, faded booths, and the comforting scent of coffee and fried food. The bell above the door jingled as Ryan stepped inside, and he spotted Emily immediately, sitting in their usual booth near the window. She looked up and grinned. "You actually showed." Ryan slid into the seat across from her. "Don't sound so surprised." Emily smirked. "I half expected you to bail." A waitress appeared, placing 2 menus in front of them. Ryan didn't need one, he already knew what he was ordering. Emily tapped her fingers against the table. "So, how was work?" Ryan sighed. "Long." She nodded. "And the gas station?" "Haven't gone in yet. I will go after this." Emily frowned. "You're working a double again?" Ryan shrugged. "Gotta do what I gotta do." Emily stared at him, then shook her head. "You know, normal people have this thing called sleep. You should try it sometime." Ryan smirked. "Sounds overrated." Emily rolled her eyes but didn't push the topic further. When their food arrived, Ryan dug in immediately. The burger was greasy, the fries were perfectly salted, and the milkshake was thick enough to make the straw practically useless. It was the best thing he'd eaten in weeks. Emily watched him for a moment before speaking. "You look tired." Ryan glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Thanks. Real confidence booster." She gave him a pointed look. "You know what I mean." Ryan sighed, setting his milkshake down. "I'm fine, Emily leaned forward. "Ryan, you're barely getting by." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I'm handling it." She hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a folded envelope. "I want you to take this." Ryan stiffened. "What is it?" "Just something to help." He didn't take it. I told you." "I know what you told me," she interrupted. "But just hear me out." Ryan exhaled sharply. "Emily. I'm not giving you charity, okay? Think of it as a loan. Pay me back whenever you can." Ryan stared at the envelope, then at her. Emily sighed. "Ryan, I know you hate this. But I hate watching you struggle even more." His hands curled into fists under the table. Every part of him screamed to say no. To push her away. To keep carrying this burden alone. But another part, one buried beneath the exhaustion, the stress, the constant pressure, wanted to accept. Ryan swallowed hard. "I'll think about it." Emily nodded. "That's all I ask." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Emily smirked. "Now hurry up and finish your food. You look like you're about to fall asleep in your fries." Ryan huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. For the first time in a long time, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. Ryan stood outside Joe's diner, gripping the envelope Emily had given him. The street lights flickered above, casting a dull yellow glow on the pavement. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, illuminating Emily's expectant face as she leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "You don't have to decide right now," she said softly. Ryan exhaled, rolling the envelope between his fingers. He knew what was inside. Tish. Probably enough to cover rent or at least give him a break for a few days. But taking it felt like admitting defeat. Emily sighed, reading his hesitation. "Ryan, it's not a big deal." "To you, maybe," he muttered, shoving the envelope back into her hands. "I can't take this." She frowned. "Why not?" "Because I don't want your money, Em." She crossed her arms. "It's not about wanting. It's about needing." Ryan clenched his jaw. "I'll figure it out." "You always say that." "Because it's true." Emily let out a frustrated breath. "Ryan, for once in your life, can you just—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Never mind." She tucked the envelope back into her bag, her expression unreadable. Silence stretched between them. The sounds of the city filled the space. The distant honking of cars, the low murmur of pedestrians, the occasional bark of a stray dog. Emily shifted on her feet. You know, you don't always have to do everything alone. Ryan forced a smirk. Where's the fun in that? Emily didn't laugh. Instead, she just studied him like she was trying to figure out what exactly it would take to make him accept help. Ryan adjusted the strap of his work bag. I gotta go. My shift starts at 10. Emily nodded slowly. Yeah. I figured. She hesitated, then reached out and squeezed his arm. It was brief, barely a second, but it lingered more than Ryan expected. Be careful, okay? She murmured. Ryan swallowed and nodded. Yeah. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The gas station was quiet when Ryan arrived. The usual hum of flickering fluorescent lights greeted him as he stepped behind the counter, clocking in. Greg, his coworker for the night, glanced up from his phone. Hey man. How's life? Ryan shrugged. Same as always. Greg chuckled. So miserable? Ryan smirked. You got it. Greg stretched his arms above his head. Well, lucky for you, the night shift's been slow. Just a couple of weirdos and the usual drunk college kids. Ryan grabbed a bottle of water from the mini fridge behind the counter. So, the usual. Greg nodded. Exactly. The hours passed in a haze of monotony. Ryan rang up customers, restocked shelves, cleaned up spills. His body moved on autopilot, but his mind wouldn't shut off. Rent. Bills. Groceries. Emily's offer. No matter how much he tried to push it aside, it sat heavy in his chest. By 2 a.m. Greg had left, leaving Ryan alone in the quiet store. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerators and the occasional rustle of plastic as he rearranged snack displays. The door chime jingled. Ryan looked up, expecting another late-night customer. Instead, a man in a gray hoodie walked in, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. Ryan's stomach tightened. Something felt off. The guy moved slowly, browsing the aisles without picking anything up. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and every so often he'd glance toward the counter. Ryan's grip on the counter edge tightened. When the man finally approached, Ryan forced a neutral expression. Need help finding anything? The man didn't answer. He just slid something onto the counter. A crumpled note. Ryan frowned, unfolding it. Empty the register. No alarms. No sudden moves. His heart slammed against his ribs. For a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. The man's hand twitched inside his hoodie pocket, and Ryan didn't need to see it to know. There was a gun. His fingers hovered over the register keys. His mind raced. Greg had told him once, if someone ever tries to rob you, just comply. No money was worth your life. But $42.76 wasn't enough to cover rent. If he handed over the cash, he'd have nothing. Ryan's throat felt dry. Look man, we don't keep a lot of cash in here, he said carefully. The man's fingers curled tighter around whatever was in his pocket. I don't care. Open it. Ryan swallowed, hesitating. In the distance, a car pulled into the parking lot. Headlights flashed through the store window, and for a split second the man turned his head. Ryan saw his chance. He slammed his palm against the panic button under the counter and took a step back. Seriously? The man's voice was low, angry. He pulled his hand from his hoodie, revealing the gun. I said no alarms. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. The man took a step forward. The door chime rang again. Ryan barely had time to register the sound before a voice cut through the tension. Hey, is everything all right here? A police officer. Ryan had never felt so relieved to see a cop in his life. The man in the hoodie tensed, his grip on the gun tightening. For a second, Ryan thought he might actually pull the trigger. But then the officer took another step inside. Sir, I need you to take your hands out of your pockets and step away from the counter. The man hesitated. The officer's hand moved toward his holster. Yow. Something in the man's posture shifted, an internal decision made. In an instant he turned and bolted. The officer chased after him, yelling commands, but Ryan barely heard it. His hands were shaking. His breath came fast and uneven. It took him a few seconds to realize he was gripping the counter so tightly his knuckles had gone white. A moment later, another officer entered, looking around. You okay, kid? Ryan forced a nod. Yeah, I'm fine. The officer glanced at the register. Does he get anything? Ryan shook his head. The officer sighed. Lucky break. Lucky. Ryan wasn't sure if he believed that. By the time his shift ended, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. The walk home felt longer than usual. When he stepped into the apartment, he found his mother still asleep in the recliner. The blanket he'd left draped over her had slipped onto the floor. Ryan bent down, picking it up and tucking it back around her shoulders. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. He lingered for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Then, with a sigh, he sat down on the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. The night had been a wake-up call. He'd been so focused on surviving that he hadn't stopped to think about how much worse things could get. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe he couldn't do this alone. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over Emily's number. After a long pause, he finally sent a message. "Ryan, about that loan, we should talk." He didn't know if accepting help made him weak. But right now he wasn't sure he cared anymore.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You're listening to The Cost of Holding On. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 3, The Weight of Pride. Ryan sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone. The message he'd sent to Emily hours ago remained unanswered. Maybe she was asleep. Or maybe she was tired of him pushing her away and had finally decided to stop trying. His fingers drummed against the table's scratched surface. A part of him hoped she wouldn't reply. If she did, it would mean he'd have to follow through, sit down, swallow his pride, and actually accept help. He hated the thought. In the other room, his mother stirred in her recliner, coughing softly in her sleep. Ryan glanced at the pile of medical bills stacked near the TV, unopened and unread. The sight was enough to push away his hesitation. Before he could talk himself out of it, he picked up his phone and called Emily. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Ryan." Her voice was thick with sleep. He hesitated. "Hey." There was a pause. "You okay?" Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah. I wanted to talk." Another pause, then the sound of rustling sheets. "Give me 10 minutes. Meet me at the diner." Ryan frowned. "It's past midnight. I'm already up. Just meet me." And just like that, the line went dead. Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. He should have known better than to argue with Emily. The diner was mostly empty when Ryan arrived. The few remaining customers were either college students cramming for exams or exhausted night shift workers nursing their coffee. Emily was in their usual booth, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. Ryan slid into the seat across from her. "You didn't have to come out this late." She arched her brow. "You called me. That's rare. I figured it was important." Ryan glanced at the table, suddenly feeling exposed. "Yeah, about that." Emily took a slow sip of her tea. "Let me guess, you changed your mind." Ryan clenched his jaw. "I don't need a handout, Em." Her eyes softened. "I never said you did. I just need a little breathing room." The words tasted bitter. "Alone. I'll pay you back." Emily tilted her head. "And what happens after that? You get through this month, but what about next month? And the month after that?" Ryan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I'll figure it out." Emily sighed, stirring her tea with her spoon. "You always say that." Ryan stayed silent. He set the spoon down. "Ryan, I know you don't want my help, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about charity. This is about you not destroying yourself just to survive." His throat felt tight. "I'm not. You are." She leaned forward. "And I get it. You want to be the one who takes care of everything. You don't want anyone to think you can't handle it. But it's okay to ask for help." Ryan exhaled sharply. "Not for me, it's not." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out the envelope from before and slid it across the table. Ryan stared at it. "It's not a loan," she said. "It's not a handout. It's just me having your back." Ryan's hands curled into fists. "Am I?" "You can be mad about it," she said softly. "But I'm not taking it back." Ryan swallowed hard. The weight of it, the frustration, the shame, the suffocating exhaustion, it all pressed against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. And yet, a small part of him felt something else. Relief. He hated that too. Ryan walked home with the envelope still in his pocket. When he reached his apartment, he found his mother awake, sitting in her recliner with a small glass of water. "You're home late," she murmured. Ryan nodded. "Had to meet someone." His mother studied him. "Everything all right?" He hesitated. Then carefully he pulled the envelope from his pocket and placed it on the small table beside her. "What's this?" she asked. "Help." His voice was quiet. "From a friend." She frowned, glancing between him and the envelope. "Ryan." "I know." His throat tightened. "But we need it." His mother's eyes glistened. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. For the first time in a long time, Ryan let himself hold on. Ryan sat in his dimly lit bedroom, the envelope still on his desk. He hadn't opened it yet. Even though he had accepted it, something inside him resisted. The numbers inside that envelope wouldn't magically fix everything. They wouldn't erase the late notices, the endless worry, or the gnawing guilt. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. His pride told him to return it, but reality whispered otherwise. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Ryan." His mother's voice was gentle. "Are you still awake?" "Yeah." She pushed the door open, stepping inside cautiously. Even in the dim light, Ryan could see the worry lines on her face. The years of working late shifts, of stretching every dollar, had aged her before her time. She looked down at the envelope. "Emily." Ryan nodded. His mother sighed, sitting on the edge of his bed. "She's a good friend." "She is," Ryan admitted. They sat in silence for a moment. "You don't have to carry this all by yourself, you know," his mother said softly. Ryan clenched his jaw. "If I don't, who will?" His mother's expression turned pained. "Ryan, when your father left, I made the mistake of thinking I had to do everything alone. That accepting help meant I was weak." Ryan looked at her, surprised. She rarely talked about his father. She gave him a sad smile. "I don't want you to make the same mistake." Ryan swallowed. "It's not that simple." "I know." She reached for his hand, squeezing it. "But you're not alone." Ryan felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to believe her. But he had spent so long trying to be strong that he wasn't sure how to let go. So he nodded. It was all he could manage. His mother gave his hand one last squeeze before standing. "Get some sleep, sweetheart." Ryan watched her leave, the weight in his chest pressing heavier than before. The next morning, Ryan made a decision. He took the envelope and walked straight to the bank. The money wouldn't solve everything, but it would buy them time. Time to figure things out, time to breathe. As he left the bank, he pulled out his phone and hesitated before typing out a message. "Ryan, thank you." A few seconds later, his phone buzzed. "Emily, took you long enough." Ryan smirked, shaking his head. For the first time in a long time, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little bit lighter.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You're listening to The Cost of Holding On. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 4, Buried Truths. Ryan sat on the front steps of his apartment building, staring at the morning sky. The crisp autumn air bit at his skin, but he welcomed it. It kept him awake, kept him grounded. The envelope was gone now, deposited, spent on bills, stretched as far as it could go. It had bought them a little time, but that time was already slipping through his fingers. The overdue notices weren't stopping. His mother's medication wouldn't pay for itself next month. And his pride? That had already taken a hit. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look like hell." Ryan turned his head to see Emily standing there, hands stuffed into the pockets of her oversized hoodie. She looked at him like she always did, like she saw through the version of himself he tried to present to the world. "Nice to see you too," he muttered. She sat beside him. "You didn't text me back last night." "I was tired." "Liar." Ryan sighed. "It's been a lot." Emily nudged his arm. "You know you can talk to me, right?" Ryan hesitated. He had already let his guard down more than he was used to. But keeping everything bottled up hadn't helped either. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Em." Emily's expression softened. "What happened?" Ryan ran a hand through his hair. "The money helped, but it wasn't enough." "It's never enough." Emily frowned. "Did something else happen?" Ryan clenched his jaw. "My mom." She had another doctor's appointment yesterday. Emily straightened. Is she okay? Ryan hesitated. They want to do more tests. Emily studied him carefully. And you're scared of what they'll find. Ryan let out a bitter laugh. Of course I am. He swallowed hard. But I can't afford to be. Emily's eyes darkened. Ryan. I have to keep moving, he interrupted. I have to figure this out. Emily stayed quiet for a moment before speaking. You don't have to figure it out alone. Ryan shook his head. I can't keep taking money from you. Emily sighed. I don't mean just me. There are programs, assistance for medical bills, charities. No, Ryan's voice was sharp. Emily narrowed her eyes. Why not? Ryan clenched his fists. Because I don't want my mom to feel like we're a charity case. Emily frowned. Ryan, needing help doesn't mean you're a failure. Ryan looked away. It feels like it. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then softly she asked, what would you do if it were me? Ryan's gaze snapped back to hers. What? If I was struggling, she said. If my family couldn't afford medical bills, if I was drowning in stress, would you let me suffer alone? Ryan opened his mouth but closed it just as quickly. She held his gaze. You wouldn't. So why do you think you deserve any less? Ryan swallowed hard. Emily reached out and squeezed his hand. You're not alone in this, Ryan. Ryan looked down at their hands, the warmth of her touch grounding him. For the first time in a long time he let himself believe her. Ryan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. His mother's doctor's office loomed ahead, the sterile white walls and glass windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight. His heart pounded, his mind racing with thoughts of worst-case scenarios. He hated this feeling, this helplessness that settled in his bones, no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. With a deep breath he stepped out and walked inside. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and coffee, a mix of comfort and anxiety. His mother sat in a chair near the window, flipping through an old magazine. When she looked up and saw him she smiled, soft but tired. Ryan, you didn't have to come. I wanted to, he said, sitting beside her. She studied him for a moment. You look exhausted. He forced a small smirk. You say that like it's new. His mother gave him a knowing look but didn't press. Instead she reached over and squeezed his hand. Before he could say anything a nurse called her name. Ryan stood with her but she shook her head. I can handle this part, sweetheart. Wait here. Ryan hesitated but nodded. He watched her disappear behind the door, the anxiety twisting tighter in his chest. He had been staring at the same spot on the floor for what felt like hours when his phone buzzed. Emily, hey, how's it going? Ryan hesitated before replying. Ryan, waiting. Feels like forever. A few seconds later his phone buzzed again. Emily, want me to distract you? Ryan let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Ryan, go for it. Emily, okay, imagine this. You, me, a ridiculous amount of ice cream and no responsibilities. Just pure, unfiltered bliss. Ryan smiled despite himself. Ryan, sounds fake but okay. Emily, I'm telling you it's a dream. Ryan leaned back in his chair, tension easing just slightly. Ryan, I'll hold you to it. Before Emily could reply, the door opened and his mother stepped out, looking pale but composed. Ryan's stomach twisted as he stood. Mom. She gave him a tired smile. Let's go home. Ryan swallowed hard. What did they say? She hesitated. We'll talk in the car. His chest tightened but he didn't push. Not yet. The drive home was silent, tension thick in the air. Ryan kept glancing at his mother, waiting for her to speak. She didn't, not until they pulled into their driveway. Once the car was in park, she sighed. They found something. Ryan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What do you mean, something? She turned to him, her expression soft but serious. They need to run more tests. But it could be serious. Ryan's stomach dropped. Seriously, how? She placed a hand over his. We don't know yet. But whatever happens, we'll handle it. Together. Ryan's throat tightened. Together. He nodded, but inside, fear clawed at his chest. Because no matter how strong he tried to be, some things, some battles, felt impossible to win.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You're listening to The Cost of Holding On. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 5. Letting Go. Ryan had always believed that if he just worked harder, fought longer, and refused to break, things would eventually get better. That was what he had told himself when his father walked out, when the bills kept piling up, when his mother's health started to decline. But as he sat in the hospital waiting room again, staring at the 2 white walls and the flickering fluorescent lights, he realized that some things weren't about endurance. Some battles aren't won by sheer force of will. Some things were just out of his control. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. His mother was in the examination room undergoing another round of tests. She had told him to go home to rest, but he couldn't. A hand landed on his shoulder. "Hey." Ryan looked up to find Emily standing there, her expression softer than he was used to seeing. She sat down beside him, not saying anything at first, just letting the silence settle between them. "How do you know I was here?" he asked finally. She lifted her phone. "Your mom texted me." Ryan let out a breath, shaking his head. "Of course she did." Emily smirked. "She's sneaky like that." He let out a hollow chuckle, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know what to do, Em." Emily leaned back in her chair. "What do you mean?" Ryan exhaled slowly. "I mean, what if it's bad news? What if I can't fix this?" Emily tilted her head. "Who says you have to fix everything?" Ryan frowned. "That's just how it is. If I don't, who will?" Emily shook her head. "Ryan, you've spent so much time trying to carry everything on your own that you don't even realize," she sighed. "You don't have to. You're allowed to lean on people. That's not a weakness." Ryan looked away. "It feels like it." Emily nudged him gently. "It's not." He swallowed hard, but before he could respond, the door to the examination room opened and his mother stepped out. She looked exhausted, but there was something in her expression, something unreadable. Ryan stood immediately. "Mom." She hesitated. "Let's talk outside." Ryan's stomach twisted as he followed her, Emily right behind him. They stepped out into the hospital parking lot, the crisp autumn air filling Ryan's lungs. He turned to his mother, bracing himself. She exhaled slowly. "The doctor says they caught it early." Ryan's breath hitched. "So?" She gave him a small, tired smile. "It means I have a fight ahead of me. But it's one I can win." Ryan's knees nearly gave out. He ran a hand through his hair, his chest tight with emotion. "You scared me," he muttered. His mother reached out, squeezing his hand. "I know, sweetheart. But we'll get through this. Together." Ryan exhaled, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. Emily placed a hand on his back, steadying him. For the first time in a long time, Ryan let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry everything alone. The drive home was quieter than usual, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence Ryan had grown used to. Instead, it was lighter, like a deep breath after a storm. His mother sat beside him in the passenger seat, staring out the window, lost in thought. "You okay?" Ryan asked, glancing at her. She turned to him with a small smile. "I should be asking you that." Ryan huffed a laugh. "I don't know. I feel like I should be relieved, and I am, but I guess I'm just still trying to process everything." His mother nodded. "That's understandable." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Ryan, I know you've been carrying so much for so long. But I need you to understand something." He looked at her, waiting. She gave him a knowing look. "It's not your job to take care of everything." Ryan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "If I don't, who will?" His mother sighed. "Ryan, I love you for how much you care. But you've put so much pressure on yourself that you don't even realize how much it's weighing you down." Ryan swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against the wheel. I didn't want to lose you." His voice was barely above a whisper. His mother's expression softened. "Sweetheart, I'm still here. And I plan to be for a long time." Ryan nodded, his throat too tight to respond. When they got home, Ryan helped his mother settle in before stepping out onto the porch. The evening air was crisp, carrying the distant sounds of the neighborhood, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint hum of passing cars. He let out a slow breath, trying to let go of the tension still coiled in his chest. A car pulled up in front of the house, and a moment later, Emily stepped out. She didn't say anything as she walked over and sat beside him on the porch steps. Ryan smirked slightly. What, you got a tracking device on me now? Emily shrugged. Your mom texted me again. Ryan shook his head, letting out a short laugh. She's relentless. She cares. Ryan nodded, staring down at his hands. Yeah. She does. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Emily nudged him. So what happens now? Ryan sighed. Now, I guess we take it one day at a time. He glanced at her. Which, for the record, I suck at. Emily smirked. Oh, I know. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. It's weird though. I've spent so long feeling like everything was on my shoulders. I don't even know what to do with myself now that I'm not alone in it. Emily tilted her head. Maybe you start by actually living. Doing things for yourself. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Like what? Emily grinned. For starters, you owe me ice cream. Ryan laughed. A real, full laugh that loosened something in his chest. All right, he said, standing. Let's go get some ice cream. Emily beamed. Now you're talking. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was finally starting to live. Think.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You have reached to the end of the story. Thank you for listening to Akumah Audiobooks. For more stories like this, refer to channel playlist and stay tuned by subscribing to the channel.